Okay, so this is just after watching it, my version of the Pinocchio movie. I honestly thought it was fantastic. I think we got a really deep dive into Geppetto, especially because you notice that he's not making the puppet to want a son. He's making the puppet so he can cope with the loss of his son. He lost the chance to be a dad. And there's actually a lot of people who I have not met in my life, but there are people in the mental health facility who have had people with puppets or fake dolls to cope with the idea of not having the chance to be a dad or not a chance to be a parent. And you know what? Sometimes that can help with loss. Um, you know, I never had the chance to be a dad, and that's why and I don't think I'll ever be. And that's why I cautionally used the uh, the little Grogu puppet to help me cope with the idea that I might never be a father. And I miss someone who to me was like a who I thought of me as a dad and a father figure. We lost connection during the COVID pandemic. And so I loved this story considering it was a storytelling about more on grief and how these puppets to us who are adults use these to cope with mental health. And children can watch these now and go, oh, that must be why some people use these things to help them cope with loss, help them cope with grief. And I liked how that was something that was deep dive into Geppetto in the first story. And I loved how you got to see how Pinocchio. I mean, there's a lot of famous people, even LGBTQ, and I loved the fact that they used an African American LGBTQ pride. Um, and she was someone who is bisexual. She came out as bisexual, and there's not a lot of representation in that. And to a child's perspective, they can look at that and hear about LGBTQ and look her up and say, "Ooh, she's LGBTQ. LGBTQ people, even someone who's African American or white, can be good." That was something I think Disney didn't really think of. I loved that about this Pinocchio adaptation. And also what I loved is that this storytelling was very dark and very creepy. And what could actually happen if you didn't listen to your conscience, that little Jiminy Cricket in your head. And what can happen when you lose that conscience and lose that perspective of wanting him whenever time when he was in chaos or trouble, or some people can make loopholes like that one Jiminy who that one fox who took Geppetto, locked him in the glass, and said, okay, this is gonna help you. And that's what happens when people who are young actresses go into show business. People who are young actors, very young, childlike, child perspective, they don't use their little Jiminy Cricket conscience to help them guide them. That actually happens. I mean, it's very sad. And I loved how there were a lot of symbolic references to people who have disabilities or mental health. Pinocchio was someone who was a very fractured and uh, very like porcelain doll, or people who have these physical or mental health disabilities that fracture them from being in school, and some schools don't allow that, and that's what happens to people in some schools. Some people don't want him, some people don't want that child because they have a disability, and they don't want him going to school, and that's why some people are so shunned from schools and so shunned from people who have a mental illness or a physical disability, that they get this idea that they have to go into acting, or they get this idea to follow stupid people like that fox who were crazy enough to let them go into show business. And I loved how this storytelling was very dark. And it is a very dark movie. I could see how some people can look at this and be like, that's wrong, but that's kind of what this movie is about. About the rawness of what happens when you go into childlike acting. And there was a character, I'm not going to say who, but there was an added character who was a porcelain, but like someone who resembled a child actress and was abused. That's what happens when people very young go into show business. And I loved how even people with disabilities, like Pinocchio resembles, can help motivate people who have been abused. And that's what that girl, that African American ballerina dancer was. And you know what? She figured out a way to use her little puppet, her marionette, to talk to Pinocchio and communicate with him. And I loved how some people need to learn to communicate in different ways. For people with disabilities and mental health, people with autism, people like Pinocchio resemble a Pinocchio themselves as autism because they have the right conscience, and they always lose their Jiminy Crickets sometimes. And so sometimes they need a little helping hand to communicate a little bit. And I love that about this Pinocchio movie. This movie, people are saying it's terrible, it's awful. Screw you. You do not know how people with disabilities or are abused can be empowered and talked to when there's different communications. And this story really deepens into what happens when children go in the wrong direction and get shipped to Pleasure Island. And I loved how the father, when someone sees the father react terribly, a child very young, can know immediately that the adult or the parent, a good adult and a good parent and a good father, which I know is very hard these days because some people can question that moral aspect of good fathers and good mothers, because if you watch, if you ever read the book I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, or look up some interesting stories on abuse, that's what people go through. And I loved how the storytelling was told And I had to say, Monstro. Oh my gosh, Monstro. Wow. The graphics were fucking amazing. I loved how this storytelling really took Monstro and made him more monstrous. And I loved how he was just so fucking huge. He was so good. So good. And I loved how, I mean, this movie is to me a 10 out of 10 right out of bat. It's the same story, but with a better detail and more empowering tale about what happens when you lose your way, lose your Jiminy Cricket conscience, and don't do what you should do and listen to that head of yours. Thank you.